Sarah Martin thought she had the perfect life: 2 kids, a successful husband, and a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. But when she began a secret affair with her 69-year-old neighbor, Gerald Nelson, she unknowingly stepped into a web of deception that would unravel everything. What started as innocent conversations over tea quickly spiraled into a dangerous obsession, and before long Sarah was caught between the man she had vowed to love and the man who now controlled her every move. As the lies piled up, Sarah realized she wasn't the only one hiding secrets, and the devastating consequences of her choices would soon shatter both her marriage and her life. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the trees stood tall and the houses looked like something straight out of a postcard, the Martin family appeared to have everything anyone could want. Their home was a charming 2-story with a neatly manicured lawn and a white picket fence that seemed to invite guests in. Sarah Martin, a 38-year-old mother of 2, was the kind of woman you'd see volunteering at the local PTA meetings, helping out with bake sales, or chatting with neighbors while walking her children to school. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Sarah, and her warm smile and friendly demeanor made her well liked by all. Her husband, Greg Martin, was the perfect picture of the successful, hard-working father. He worked long hours as a lawyer and was known for his ambition and sharp mind. Greg wasn't home much, as his job required late nights and weekend meetings, but he always made time for Sarah and their 2 children, Olivia and Ethan, when he could. Their marriage seemed solid from the outside, stable, loving, and secure. Next door, the Nelson family had only recently moved in. Gerald Nelson, a 69-year-old retiree, had relocated to the area with his wife, Evelyn, a woman much younger than him. While Evelyn kept to herself, Gerald had quickly become a fixture in the neighborhood. He wasn't particularly social, but he was friendly enough. Gerald spent his days in his garden, tending to his flowers and shrubs, and he often sat on his front porch in the afternoon, reading newspapers or books. He seemed harmless enough, a kind old man who enjoyed the simple pleasures of retirement. The Martins and the Nelsons had little reason to interact at first, but over time Sarah and Gerald began exchanging pleasantries whenever their paths crossed. It started with casual greetings as Sarah walked by on her morning runs, admiring his garden or asking for gardening tips. Gerald, a man who'd spent years perfecting his backyard, was more than happy to share his knowledge. The conversations grew longer, with Sarah sometimes stopping by to chat after picking up the kids from school. Soon, the 2 were spending more and more time together. Gerald, despite his age, had a certain charm about him, and Sarah found herself drawn to his calm, easygoing nature. He was a stark contrast to Greg, who was often consumed by work and too exhausted to engage with Sarah on a personal level. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just 2 neighbors bonding over their shared love of gardening. But there was an undercurrent beneath the surface. Sarah, who had always been the nurturing, family-oriented type, started to enjoy the attention Gerald lavished on her. It wasn't just about flowers anymore. They began discussing her life, her marriage, and the frustrations she'd been feeling. Greg had always been a devoted husband, but his demanding job left little room for emotional connection. He didn't see the cracks forming in his marriage. Sarah's growing interest in Gerald was a secret she kept hidden, though it wasn't long before it began to affect her. She became more distant, distracted during family time, and less engaged with the people who mattered most to her. Her once cheerful disposition turned cloudy, as if something was weighing heavily on her mind. Still, she smiled through the days, and no one suspected what was brewing just beneath the surface of the perfect suburban life. The friendship between Sarah and Gerald, though unspoken and covert, was quickly becoming more than just that. Neither Sarah nor Gerald could fully recognize the danger they were heading towards, but the signs were already there, quietly creeping into the corners of their lives. No one would have guessed that what had begun as innocent Neighborly exchanges would spiral into something darker, something no one could have ever anticipated. The summer heat brought a certain stillness to the neighborhood, a heavy quiet that seemed to settle over the houses. The trees, once lush and green, stood like silent sentinels, their leaves beginning to turn golden at the edges. Sarah's days began to follow a familiar routine. She would drop her children off at school, run errands, and then, as the clock struck noon, she'd find herself standing at the edge of her yard, looking over the low fence that separated her home from Gerald's. The first few times it had been innocent enough chit-chat about the weather, some gardening advice, or a quick exchange of pleasantries. But as the weeks wore on, Sarah found herself lingering longer and longer by the fence. Gerald's old-fashioned charm, his quiet, attentive manner made her feel heard in a way she hadn't in months. Her marriage to Greg, despite being stable on the surface, had grown stale. Greg was always busy, his long hours at the law firm consumed him, leaving Sarah to manage the house and children on her own. Over time she had grown accustomed to his absences, and though she tried to make the best of it, there was a nagging sense of loneliness she couldn't shake. Gerald, on the other hand, had time. He had time for the little things that Sarah missed: time for conversation, time for a cup of tea on the porch, time to listen. As their chats continued, Sarah found herself confiding in him about her frustrations. She told him about the distance between her and Greg, about the quiet resentment that had slowly built up over the years. Gerald listened attentively, his eyes soft with understanding. And though Sarah would never have admitted it to herself, she began to look forward to these talks more than anything else in her day. It wasn't long before their exchanges became more intimate. They started meeting in the afternoons, when the heat of the day made it difficult to do much else. Sometimes Sarah would stop by just to admire Gerald's garden, but they both knew there was more to it than that. One afternoon, Gerald invited her inside. She hesitated at first, but soon followed him through the door into his living room. It was modest, filled with old bookshelves, family pictures, and the faint scent of lavender. Gerald made tea, and they sat together, talking about life in a way that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. The line between friendship and something more began to blur. Sarah started to enjoy the attention more than she cared to admit. Gerald was always full of compliments, telling her how beautiful she looked, how youthful and vibrant she seemed, how much he appreciated her presence. Each compliment landed like a spark, reigniting something inside her that she hadn't even realized had been smoldering for years. When they sat together, it was as if the world outside disappeared. The weight of her own life, her role as wife and mother, faded into the background, and for the first time in a long time she felt truly seen. Days turned into weeks, and the secret between them grew heavier. Sarah's behavior began to change. She became more distracted, more absent-minded at home. She started skipping out on family dinners, telling Greg she was too tired or had too much to do. Greg, oblivious to the growing distance between them, continued to focus on his work. He never suspected anything was amiss. As for Gerald, he too had grown attached to Sarah, though his intentions were more sinister. What had started as an innocent flirtation had evolved into something much more possessive. Gerald, with his gentle, unassuming demeanor, began to make subtle advances. He would touch her arm during their conversations or lean in a little too close when handing her a cup of tea. At first, Sarah brushed these moments off as harmless, but slowly a seed of doubt began to form. She was married. She had children. What she was doing was wrong. And yet, every time she saw Gerald, she couldn't help herself. By the end of the summer, it was no longer a secret. Their affair had become undeniable, though neither of them had spoken the words aloud. They were drawn to each other in ways neither could explain, trapped in a web they had woven together without fully understanding the consequences. Sarah's heart, once tethered to her family, now beat faster at the thought of Gerald. She didn't know how to stop, and even more troubling, she didn't want to. It was a Wednesday when things began to fall apart. The evening had started like any other, with Sarah dropping the kids off at their friend's house for a play date, an hour of quiet she had come to cherish. She told Greg she'd be out running errands for a while, which in itself wasn't unusual. But tonight, as she walked down the familiar path to Gerald's house, something in the air felt different. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was the night everything would change. The past few days had been charged with tension, a mix of excitement and guilt swirling inside her. Sarah had begun to question the direction her life was taking, wondering whether what she had with Gerald was simply an escape or something deeper, something real. She had told herself it was just a fleeting affair, something that would eventually burn out, but deep down she knew it was more complicated than that. She had come to depend on the solace Gerald provided, his presence filling the spaces that Greg's absence had left behind. As Sarah approached the Nelsons' house, she saw Gerald's familiar silhouette through the front window, standing by his old leather armchair, sipping tea. He seemed to be waiting for her, and the thought made her heart race. She rang the doorbell, her fingers trembling slightly, and when Gerald opened the door, he smiled warm and inviting as always. But this time there was something different about the way he looked at her, something darker. They went inside, and Sarah, as usual, admired the calmness of Gerald's home, the soft lighting, the antique furniture, the sense of peace that seemed to surround everything. But tonight it felt colder somehow. She couldn't put her finger on why, but it wasn't the same. The conversation started innocuously enough. They talked about gardening, as they often did. But tonight their words seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, the pauses between sentences charged with something unsaid. Gerald's compliments were more persistent, his touches more frequent. He leaned in closer than normal when handing her a cup of tea, his hand brushing hers in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. His gaze lingered on her face, his eyes burning with an intensity she hadn't noticed before. Then, without warning, Gerald reached out and cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing her jawline in a way that made Sarah's breath catch. The moment felt suspended in time. She should have pulled away, should have told him this was wrong, but instead she froze. In the silence that followed, their lips met, tentative at first, then more urgently, as if the act itself was inevitable, long overdue. As the kiss deepened, Sarah felt both a rush of exhilaration and a rising wave of panic. She pulled back, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't what she had planned, but something inside her, a part she'd been denying for so long, begged for more. Gerald, sensing her hesitation, didn't stop. He kissed her again, more forcefully this time, and Sarah, despite the fear creeping up her spine, let him. For the first time in months she felt wanted, desired, in a way that Greg hadn't made her feel in years. But in the back of her mind, something tugged at her. The image of her children flashed in her thoughts. Greg's face, his tired eyes, his endless work suddenly seemed distant, like a life she no longer recognized. And yet, as she stood there, in Gerald's arms, the world outside seemed to fade away. Just then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the silence. It was Greg's car. Sarah's heart stopped. She pulled away from Gerald abruptly, panic rising within her chest. Gerald, ever the calm and collected man, smiled reassuringly and gently patted her hand. "It's all right," he whispered, though his eyes had darkened. "No one has to know." Sarah, shaking, stepped back, her mind racing. She had to leave. Now, she couldn't let Greg find her here, in this moment with Gerald. She grabbed her purse and rushed toward the door, her pulse thundering in her ears. Gerald didn't try to stop her. He simply watched her go, his expression unreadable. As Sarah stepped outside, she found herself standing on the doorstep, her legs unsteady. Greg's car was now parked in the driveway, and the lights inside the house flickered on. She had seconds to decide should she go inside and face him, or should she run. The guilt was suffocating, but at the same time, the tension, the secret thrill of the affair, pulled her in another direction. She turned back toward Gerald's house, half expecting to hear the door slam shut behind her. Instead, she heard the faint creak of the porch swing as Gerald slowly sat down. The stillness of the evening was deafening, and yet, inside her, everything felt like it was falling apart. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, torn between the two lives she was leading. Then, she turned and walked back toward her own home, her mind swirling with confusion and regret. She could hear Greg's voice calling out to her from inside the house, but it sounded distant, like an echo from another world. She had no idea then that this night would be the turning point, the night when her double life would start to unravel. The days following Sarah's unexpected return home that evening were a blur. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the thrill. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for Gerald, nor the weight of the secret they were both carrying. The affair, though brief, had ignited something in her, something she didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. Yet, as much as she told herself it had been a moment of weakness, it was clear that a line had been crossed. The tension between Sarah and Greg grew palpable. He, unaware of what had truly transpired, had noticed her distance long before that night. But now the cracks in their marriage were more evident than ever. His attempts to engage her, to draw her back into their life, were met with short responses or cold indifference. Sarah began to feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her. She found herself avoiding Greg more, preferring the solace of her thoughts, or worse, the unspoken refuge in Gerald's presence. But she knew she couldn't keep up the charade for much longer. Every time she spoke to Greg, every time he asked her about her day, she found herself lying. Her once effortless ability to maintain the image of the happy wife and mother now felt suffocating. It wasn't long before the first sign of trouble appeared. Sarah had been home alone one afternoon when she received a call from the private investigator she had hired months ago, on a hunch that something wasn't right in her marriage. Greg had suspected her of an affair before, but she had always brushed it off as paranoia. However, recently she'd seen the unmistakable signs in his eyes, a look of suspicion, of doubt. The investigator, a man she had hired on the sly, had tracked her movements for weeks. He had discovered her repeated visits to the Nelsons' house, the time she had spent there, the small details that added up to an affair. He knew more than Sarah had realized, and he was now telling her that he had enough evidence to confirm her suspicions. Her heart raced as she listened to his words. "It's him, isn't it?" he asked quietly, almost as though he already knew the answer. Gerald Nelson, the man she had allowed herself to grow attached to. The man who had become more than a friend, someone who had transformed her world in ways she couldn't yet fully explain. She didn't respond immediately, but the silence spoke volumes. The private investigator had pieced it together, and so had she. The discovery of her affair weighed heavily on Sarah, but even more unsettling was the sudden realization that she was no longer sure who she was. She had become someone else in those stolen moments with Gerald, someone whose life had begun to spiral out of control. The truth was inescapable now, and the thought of facing Greg, of telling him everything, made her stomach turn. That evening she went over to Gerald's house once again, her steps slower than usual. It was almost as though she knew, deep down, that she couldn't keep running away from the truth. Gerald welcomed her in, his usual quiet smile hiding something darker in his eyes. He was watching her closely, waiting for her to speak, to reveal her turmoil. "I can't do this anymore, Gerald," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were shaking as she sat down across from him, the room suddenly feeling smaller, more confining than ever. "I can't keep lying to him, to myself." Gerald, for a moment, was silent. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and something else, something colder, sharper. The charm that had once drawn Sarah in seemed now to be laced with manipulation. He didn't say anything at first, but his expression shifted, and Sarah felt the unease in her chest grow. "You know we can't just stop this," Gerald said softly, his voice laced with a kind of calm certainty. "It's too late for that, Sarah." She recoiled, startled by the finality in his tone. The weight of what she was hearing settled heavily on her chest. Gerald, the man who had been a source of comfort, was no longer the same person. She could feel it now, the shift, the subtle change in his demeanor. What had once seemed like a harmless affair was now tangled in darker, more dangerous threads. "I've told you from the start. This isn't just some fling," Gerald continued, his voice lower now, more insistent. "You're mine, Sarah. You can't walk away from this." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. What had started as an escape from her own frustrations, a brief dalliance to fill the emptiness she felt in her marriage, had evolved into something much more complex and more dangerous. The man who had once seemed like a quiet neighbor had slowly revealed himself to be something else entirely controlling, possessive, and unwilling to let her go. Fear crept up Sarah's spine as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. She wasn't just caught in an affair anymore, she was entangled in something that might consume her whole. Gerald wasn't going to let her walk away easily, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that leaving would come at a price. She stood up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest, the desire to escape overwhelming every other feeling. "I can't do this, Gerald," she repeated, her voice now firm. "I can't keep living this lie." But as she turned to leave, Gerald's hand shot out, gripping her arm with a force that startled her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw a glimpse of the man behind the facades who wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The next few days felt like a waking nightmare for Sarah. She couldn't escape the images of her confrontation with Gerald. His grip on her arm, the cold determination in his eyes, it was all too much. She had been foolish to think she could walk away from the affair so easily. Now she felt trapped, caught between the life she had with Greg and the increasingly suffocating hold Gerald had over her. What had started as a brief escape from a mundane reality had escalated into something much darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Greg, oblivious to the full extent of Sarah's betrayal, began to sense that something was wrong. She was distant, her once genuine smile now forced, and her behavior became erratic. She couldn't focus on conversations, her thoughts always drifting back to Gerald and the weight of the secret she was carrying. The tension at home was palpable, and Greg started to ask more questions. "Are you okay?" he would say, his voice tinged with concern. "You've been so off lately." Sarah couldn't lie to him anymore. She felt it in her gut she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The guilt ate away at her, and the fear of Greg discovering the truth paralyzed her. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her family, her thoughts were drawn to the affair that had consumed her life. One evening, when Greg was out at a business dinner, Sarah found herself sitting in the quiet of the living room, the house still except for the ticking of the clock. She stared at her phone, contemplating whether to reach out to Gerald. But the fear held her back, fear of what he might do, fear of the things he had said that night. She had never seen him so cold, so calculating. It was as if she had become a possession, something he could never let go of. Her phone buzzed suddenly, snapping her out of her trance. It was a message from Greg. "I'm coming home early tonight." "I miss you." The warmth of the words should have comforted her, but instead, they only deepened the pit in her stomach. She couldn't keep lying. She couldn't keep living this double life. But before she could decide what to do next, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Gerald, and the words were unsettling. "We need to talk. Now." Panic surged through her as she read the message over and over. Gerald had never been this direct before, never demanded immediate attention. She didn't want to go back to him, she didn't want to face him, but a part of her knew she had no choice. She couldn't outrun the chaos she had created. Minutes later, as she drove towards Gerald's house, her mind raced. She thought about what she would say to him. Would she end it? Was it possible to just walk away, to return to the life she had left behind? She tried to calm herself, but the closer she got to his home, the more she felt the weight of the situation pressing in. When she arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Gerald's car was parked outside, but the lights inside were dimmed. She hesitated before knocking, unsure of what to expect. When the door creaked open, Gerald stood there, his expression unreadable. The warmth that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced by an unsettling calmness. "Come in," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. Sarah stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click. She barely had time to register the surroundings before Gerald spoke again, his voice colder this time. "I know about the investigator." The words hit Sarah like a punch. Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Panic flooded her chest as she searched his face for any sign of emotion. His expression was still unreadable, but there was a tension in his eyes that made her uneasy. "I know you've been hiding things from your husband," he continued, his tone now dangerous. "And I know you've been lying to me too." Sarah tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the right thing to say. She wanted to explain, to beg him to let her go, but she knew that no explanation would change the fact that she was trapped, caught in a web of her own making. Gerald took a step toward her, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can leave now, Sarah?" His voice was soft, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. "You think you can just walk away and go back to your perfect little life? It's not that easy." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her hands trembling, her body frozen in fear. Gerald's demeanor had shifted completely. The charming, affable man she had known was gone. In his place stood someone entirely different, someone dangerous, someone capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Before she could respond, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Someone was at the door. "Greg." Sarah's heart stopped. Gerald looked at her, a small, knowing smile curling at the corners of his lips. "I'll handle this," he said, as if he were in control of the situation. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, and Sarah's pulse raced. She had seconds to make a decision: stay and face the consequences of her actions, or run, risking everything for a chance at escape. She knew Gerald wasn't going to let her go easily, but the truth was that she had no idea just how far he was willing to go. The quiet suburban life she had once known was now slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure if she could stop the storm that was about to hit. And then, as the door creaked open to reveal Greg's puzzled face, Sarah's worst fear came to life. Gerald wasn't just a man she had cheated with, he had become something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The game was over.